the Escapegoat Podcast, a podcast series featuring the discussion of many different topics, flaws and all, based on personal whims and fascinations. Hosted by me, David Fagiani, and several different guests. Welcome to the Escapegoat Podcast, episode 38. I'm really happy to welcome to the show two people who've been on it. This is what we did with the first episode of this series as well. It's really nice to be able to recombine people. I'd like to welcome my friends Kat Hamilton and Nanina Gilder. How are you doing? Kat, how are you getting on?
Well, thanks so much for having me on. And it's so nice to be able to meet Nanina now that I've heard of her. Your reputation precedes you. But yeah, good to be here. Glad to be alive.
Isn't that the truth? And Nanina, how are you getting on?
I'm getting on okay. A little scrambled, but doing all right. And it is lovely to get to digitally meet you too, Kat. I have an immense respect for editors and think that it's a really amazing part of television and cinema.
Oh, thank you.
So, yeah.
Oh, isn't that nice? Isn't that nice? and now you will fight to the death. Go. No, that's next week. It's great to have you both on, and I'm really thrilled to kind of have the privilege of both of your insight and takes on one of my favourite movies. Because I think when I pitched this to both of you, a month ago or more, I was sort of framed it as that, and we're here to talk about Walkabout, the 1971 Nick Roeg directed movie. And I just wanted to, because I think you two both watched this for the first time for this podcast, which is really cool, and thank you for doing that. But it does also free me up to be completely self-centered and talk just a little bit about my background with the movie and I guess how I came to it and why I like it so much. So I'll just do that briefly, and then we'll more focus on what you guys think about it, because that's more interesting to me. But Walkabout for me for a while has been one of those go-to movies that when people rarely ask what your favorite movie is or what your favorite movies are, it's always up there for me. And it became, I think, as early as my late teens, it became kind of one of the movies that I said was my favorite movie. And I was thinking back to when I saw it, and I think it was in that kind of 13 to 15 year old age bracket for me, where if you are a bit of a sort of teenage film nerd and enthusiast, you're seeing an awful lot of movies around then, but you're also seeing the first kind of movies that stretch your kind of conception of what movies are, I guess, like the kind of slightly maybe more experimental, maybe more bold, but certainly more extreme if you're watching some horror cinema or crime cinema and things like that. And I think Walkabout, I was trying to get the chronology right, I think I almost consider Walkabout one of the three that I watched probably in that 13 to 15 bracket, which were, I think first would probably be 2001: A Space Odyssey, and then probably Walkabout, and then in swift succession Eraserhead. So certainly within a sort of 2-year period I saw all of those. And I was actually thinking about what those have in common, and one of the things they have in common that's kind of an obvious feature of them is this kind of overwhelming sonic experience that they are. That they all have, they're all stunning visually, but they also kind of use sound in a way that I guess I hadn't experienced with more sort of generic fare, whether for kids or adults, before that. So I was thinking about that, but I think that the specific way in which I encountered Walkabout was my dad told me the beginning of it. Basically, he told me. I think he noticed in the Radio Times, or in the UK, he noticed in the Radio Times that Walkabout was on late night BBC Two, and I was like, oh, that's intriguing. What's that? And he was like, yeah. So the beginning. Do you know what happens at the beginning of the film? I was like, nope. And he was like, okay, so spoilers for Walkabout. A dad takes his kids out into the desert and tries to kill them, and then kills himself. And I was like, okay. And he was like, yeah, you should give it a go. And I was like, all right. And I don't know what that says about my dad, but I was kind of I was thinking, I think obviously we had loads of VHSs lying around when I was a kid and a teenager, and we picked loads of stuff up from our parents' VHS collection, but this was something that I had to record for myself. I think Dad pointed me in the right direction, and then I actually set the video and recorded it late night and watched it that week. And I remember being sort of knowing the beginning, because as a spoiler for Walkabout, that event is within the first 15 minutes. It's sort of the premise, but also in some ways doesn't have a lot to do with the rest of the movies, although we can discuss how much it may do. But it was a great teaser, and I remember this was the period when I was watching a lot of movies late night alone, essentially, in my bedroom. So I had a VHS player and TV in my room, often kind of like a bit sleepy as well. So I'd see a lot of these movies through an almost pre-drug kind of slightly narcotic haze of being tired. And it's kind of, I think there's a good movie for that. But can I ask you guys if you've, before you react to the movie specifically, had you seen any Nick Rogue movies that you know of before this? Kat first.
Not that I know of. I don't.
And Nina?
I hadn't. I was aware of there had been a retrospective of his films on Criterion Channel around the time that he passed away. So I was aware that they existed, and I had heard of a few of them, but I had not checked them out.
That's interesting, because I, a year or two after I saw Walkabout, I saw Don't Look Now, and following that I saw like The Man Who Fell to Earth, and a couple of his other movies, Bad Timing and things like that. But I realised after many years later that before Walkabout I'd actually seen one of his other movies, which is his adaptation of Roald Dahl's The Witches, which came out in, I think, 1990. And if you watch it, because I have seen it since I was an adult, if you watch it knowing it's Nick Rogue, there are some, obviously The Witches is a weird story, but there are some weird stylistic touches and things in it, which you're like, oh, okay, that's kind of a Nick Rogue movie, but it's fair to say it's more of a studio Nick Rogue movie, But yeah, Walkabout was the first one that I was aware of that. And I suppose one of the first times when I was watching something that was really kind of unignorably auteurist, I guess you might say, outside. I'd probably seen a couple of Hitchcock movies by that stage and things like that, and as I say, things like Kubrick movies and things like that. But this was kind of out there in a lot of other aesthetic ways that we'll touch on. I mean, Kat, what did you watch this week, right?
Yeah, I actually watched it last night. And it's funny because I was dog sitting and my dad came home, and it was his dog, and I paused it and I was like, well, do you want to watch the rest of this movie with me, and I'll tell you the premise. So instead of my dad telling me about the kids getting shot at in the start and the dad killing himself, I told my dad about it, and he went, all right, let's watch the rest of it. So he watched the rest of it with me.
Nice.
And this happens sometimes with my dad when he steps in on a movie. It just happens to be right before somebody takes their shirt off, right before there's boobs flying around, which happened in this one as well.
Yeah, that'll happen.
And I was like, I swear it hasn't been like this the whole time.
And what was your kind of? It's hard to get someone to summarize a take when you're about to discuss the film in depth, isn't it? But,
sure.
I mean, what was your sort of initial impression of it?
I kind of understand why there could be some parallels with 2001, and maybe it's just the general 1960s, 1970s filmic feel that, just screams cinema of that era. I think that there are some really interesting sort of elements, almost of documentary in it, 1970s ethnographic documentary. I got a little bored of the close-ups of dying animals or dead animals with that kind of macro focus. And I was like, oh yes, it's very meaningful. Thank you. We can move on. I think there's some things in it that were probably way ahead of its time, and we're establishing some stylistic things that today, if used, are probably very cheesy, but at that time, I think probably were really powerful. I think that bugged me about this movie is just how it feels like it just ends really suddenly. I feel like the ending's really unsatisfying, but that it's stylistically interesting.
Yeah, but I think there's a lot to expand on that later in the show. Actually, I kind of when you talk about the ending, we'll definitely come back to that. And I think I want to talk briefly about what I've read about the book. I haven't read the book, but I was looking at the plot, and there are some differences in the book that this is fairly loosely based on that I think probably gives some idea of how satisfying the plot is or could be,
right.
If you see what I mean. Nina, what was your kind of take on it when you first watched it?
Well, just also one of the I also haven't read the book, but was reading about the book, and it seems one of the main differences is the way that they end up in the desert, and in the book there is no father taking them out to the desert to kill them and himself. It's a plane crash. So that takes quite a lot of the tone difference.
Yeah. The survivors of what's, I think, a perfectly innocent plane crash, in a sense, like a blameless plane crash. which you're right, changes the tone right from the very start an awful lot, I think, and makes it much less disturbing.
Yeah.
Because I think the first, I think it's about 35 minutes before they encounter, the boy in this, it got like a mini horror movie in some ways.
Oh, for sure.
And there are quite a few sort of horrific images within the context of the whole film, including all of those close-ups of the dead and dying animals, but also aspects of the suicide sort of replaying itself and the decomposition of the father's body that you see at a later point.
Yeah, it's one of the ways in which Rogue uses the editing, isn't it, that he's famous for, to the sort of temporarily dislocating editing, is that I think at least once you get the father's actual suicide replayed, and you definitely get them frolicking in the outback at one point, whilst, as you say, like the corpse is kind of picked over by Aborigines, and it's kind of it's really the haunting, the violence and dislocation at the beginning of the movie permeates or at least recurs later on.
Well, one thing about the Aboriginal people, they're picking over the car, but in a mirror with the ending, they have moved the body so that he is not touching the ground, so that he's up in the tree, which obviously has strong implications with the... Do we want to keep big spoilers for the second half of the podcast, or
no, we don't tend to do spoilers like that on this podcast. No, this is please if you've got this far in, go and watch Walkabout and then come back. In fact, just don't have listened this far in, if that's possible.
But yeah, so then you see the hanging in a tree again much more vividly with the boy at the end. Yeah, it's a very intense film, and stylistically is definitely trying to keep things at an emotional intensity, while also it's both slow burn, but it's very hard to I had to watch it twice to sort of figure out what I felt about it. And in the end, I don't think it fully worked for me. And there are things that I can admire about the style of it, and things that I think that it's trying to say that sometimes were perhaps a little heavy-handed. And there are some moments of real beauty, and I think that David Quilpa, who plays the boy, is an incredibly charismatic presence, though I wish that his character... I mean, I feel like the character that is allowed the most complexity is actually the little boy.
Yeah.
And...
Who is that? We should say that he's the director's actual son, right?
Yeah.
Luke Rogue.
Oh, really?
Yeah, who's gone on apparently to become a very successful film producer in his own right.
And nobody's named in this film, including the father, right? Everybody's just kind of like the girl, the boy, the smaller boy.
Yeah.
That's right. Was it you, Nanina, I was messaging before this podcast and saying that, sort of accidentally alighting on a pun when I was saying that, Nick Rogue made a film where a father takes his kids out into the desert and shoots at them by taking his own son out into the desert and shooting him.
Yes, that was.
Must be very strange. I was just thinking that, when you have some of the more pastoral shots of the kids, like towards the end of the movie and stuff, and I was just thinking how it's kind of accidentally also a sort of family album for Nick Rogue and his family, it's kind of, it must be really, really odd involving your kids in your work like that, it's really, really strange. I can think of worse things as a 9-year-old boy or something than being taken out into the desert and hang out with Jenny Agutter for a few weeks at a formative age. That's definitely, I'd remember that. It'd be one for the diary, I think.
I was just going to say that I think that one of the most effective things in the film is how they used the landscape and these pretty incredible and often harsh and sometimes lush, and that the landscape itself is its own sort of character in the film, and it's beautifully shot. And some of the scenes where the figures are really quite small in this all-encompassing world that they are both lost in, but also kind of becoming part of. And the ways that the little boy and the girl, after meeting the boy, take on there's exchanges between, sometimes the boy is wearing, tied around his waist, I think, the little boy's jacket perhaps, and while the brother and sister are sort of becoming losing the trappings of their sort of society as well, though there's a whole thing about them trying to maintain that too. But after they meet the boy, there's a little bit more of sort of bleeding between the two types of societies and cultures.
Yeah, the costumes and the malleability of the costumes kind of becomes part of what they're saying about the fluidity, I guess, or the lack of rigidity as they get into the Outback properly. I was actually thinking, watching it this time around, just, you know, that whole, as I say, that whole first opening 35 minutes, even after they've left the dad, is like a horror movie, and part of it is just watching how long it takes them to take off any clothes at all. You know, it's just like watching. I remember even as a kid, the painfulness of like watching them in full school uniform, including like starched blazers and hats and stuff. You know, like kind of. I guess the hats might do you some good in a sense, but you know, it's just like the pains they take to, or I suppose that she takes as their sort of leader. You know, to not let any lack of reserve, lack of kind of, you know, British Australian reserve show. You know.
Yeah, I was pretty surprised at how late in the game the boy shows up, because I was like, this is like a horror slice of life kind of film going on right now. You know, kind of, you know, it's interesting that the only real big plot point that this film has was introduced to the film that wasn't in the book originally, as Nanina pointed out. But of course, you're going to have these really weird temporal dislocations when you're in this place for so long, and there's this stretch of expanse. And I think that they did do really well with those, you know, wild zoom outs that kind of made me laugh. But then it would get to the full wide, and I'd just be like, oh shit, like there isn't anything for miles and miles, and you really feel that. And I think that this film gets really corporeal really frequently, and it really sensual, not just in the sense of the sexual tension that starts to come up between the boy and this girl, but also the animals burrowing, and you can really like feel the sand, like with this macro focus. You can feel the heat. You can, you know, there's so much about this that really plays with the senses a lot, which I liked. You know, and there was this editing technique they used pretty frequently, which was something I hadn't really seen before, where you get a fade between a very, very long fade between two clips, but then there will be a third clip that comes up in the middle of the fade and fades off before the time of the longer fade ends, which is this really weird blending of stuff. And I think that it's probably supposed to be going towards this idea of how time blends in the desert, in this space.
I think it's the sort of sensuality that you described there. I was thinking when I was rewatching it this time that, you know, even the way the little boy eats the fruit, you know, when they find that kind of oasis temporarily just before they meet the boy, it's really like kind of like lovingly, but also kind of slightly disgustingly, kind of overpoweringly portrayed, isn't it? You know, 'cause it's really intense, and it's really kind of, you know, I guess what you call the Foley in this movie is just interestingly intense in general.
Yeah.
But it is yeah. I mean, just the how important resources become in that environment. You know, like one of the bits that gets played as a clip outside this movie quite a bit, I think, because it's one of the few clips you can take with like dialogue where you can kind of get what they're getting at, is like the bit when they first meet the boy and the girl is asking for water, and she just can't think of a more obvious way. She can't think of a more obvious way to say water than the way that, you know, British tourists try and talk when they're abroad, essentially, of just repeating it over and over again.
Can't you understand? I can't say it any clearer than that.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. With that one fact, and then obviously, I love the way the the little boy is just watching her as well throughout that, and then he finally just steps forward. He's like, actually mimes it going down his throat. He's just like, yeah, that's and I like the way the boy laughs when he gets how laboured her attempt to ask for that has been as well. It's a really nice moment of translation, but it's also one that kind of sets up the fact that the little boy, I suppose, is going to bond more successfully with the boy in some respects, and in the end to sort of really damaging and upsetting respects, because the girl has been, shall we say, civilized to a degree that means that she can't do a lot of stuff anymore, or other things she can do are so on rails, if you see what I mean.
Qua palingape jarle palingape pan bol yan papa belak nyam nyene ngar be pan nyere nyoko ne yol ngopol ma are jeni ngar go kar mangadawa arkar makane.
I want to think! Where are the others? You can't quick, stop him! He's going away!
We're English. English. Do you understand? This is Australia, yes? Where is Adelaide?
Asking for water!
Nyamo ban gayen me panyar panere.
Water. Drink. We want water to drink. You must understand. Anyone can understand that. We want to drink. I can't make it any simpler. Water to drink. The water hole has dried up. Where do they keep the water?
Water!
Gape gape. Gape benga. Morka gape ben me. Wabalem jal tele makape.
One of the things I really, really love about this movie is I think it suggests that the boy and the girl's lives are both quite firmly on rails at this point. They're just different rails. I think what I think offsets, because I think, Kat, you were talking about some elements of this that have maybe dated, not just stylistically, but kind of, I guess you might say thematically, a little bit from the sort of late 60s, early 70s wave of movies. And I think one of the things I have less, I wouldn't say patience, but one of the things that works less for me in this is what you might call the more kind of utopian hippie culture kind of bits, or at least the more overt nods. But what I quite like is the kind of like maybe slightly concurrent but also kind of opposed reading of the movie, where it just shows that actually most of the world is hell of a different sort, and it's just you learn very well how to survive in your own version of it,
Yeah, I think what's so bizarre about the ending of this film for me is, with this slice of life thing, you have to have all these sort of elements that are visually interesting and just interesting to the senses to hold your attention, to kind of straddle that, slow burn that Nanina was mentioning, but also keeping you with it, not actually dropping the ball. But we're seeing so many details of what's going on when not a lot's going on. And then there's this mad rush to try to get so many events in this third act. And there's a lot that they leave out, that they don't show. So we go from like seeing absolutely every detail of what's happening with these kids in the desert, and it's slow. And then we get these like, just, you have to fill in the gaps for what might have happened here. We see the boy, with that kind of like in the Native American advertisement where they have this crying Native American man. You have a very similar shot of this boy with the tear going down his cheek,
You
watching
mean the
these.
crying Italian man in the advertisement?
What's that?
Oh, there was something about his heritage, wasn't there? Yeah.
Oh,
turned out to
really?
be
Oh,
not
okay.
quite as Native American as they might have liked. Yeah.
Supposedly.
But sorry.
American Aboriginal, supposedly. So he has this tear going down his face watching these guys hunt, and it's really nicely intercut with showing the way that he would hunt, and so throwing a spear and clubbing and all of that business. But just you do see these hunters and think, wow, that's so wasteful. But I just don't understand how you go from that to him being in the tree and being dead. And it took me a while to be like, is he dead? Is he playing dead? Like, I didn't understand what was going on there. And then it's like you see the girl and her little brother going into this caravan park, and they get turned away, and the guy's like, what are you doing here? And then suddenly we see that she's back in society. And then we have this weird like graduate moment where she's in the back of the bus with her to-be husband, and then is thinking about the boy as though like maybe he was an option. And I was just like, what just happened? What just happened in the last 15 minutes of this movie?
That's interesting to compare it to The Graduate, actually, because obviously this was only sort of released about 3 years after that. Was it 3-4 years after that? And so I imagine that kind of ambiguous ending, especially around kind of coming of age, would have been in the air. I just want to part the stuff about the ending, Cat and the resolution. I just want to part that a bit because we will come back to that, I promise. But Nina, I just want to ask, like, what's your kind of take on Jenny Agutter in this movie? Because I think she's really fascinating in this. Actually, I think that's it's partly her as an actress, as a young actress, but it's also partly the character, I think, and actually the script as well. But what was your read on that?
Well, she's definitely doing a very, I think, purposefully flat performance for a lot of it, because as a character, she's trying to keep things under control and be there for her brother and keep her brother going and keep herself going. But there isn't a lot of emotion to the performance, which I think is a deliberate choice made by her and the director.
Does she talk much about her own performance in the commentary track? Because I know I haven't, but I know you've listened to the commentary track with Nick Rogue and Jenny Agutter separately recording commentary tracks to it. Does she talk at all about her own performances, as her perspective as an older actress about it?
She talks a little bit in terms of the fact that Nick Rogue was more of an action-based director rather than an emotion-based. So he wasn't so much telling them what they were feeling in the situation. He was telling them, okay, and you run from the car to behind that rock, and sort of letting the emotional chips fall where they may. And so I think that probably a lot of the acting choices she made were her own choices, but that Rogue would have probably, if he felt they had been the wrong ones, he would have probably stepped in and made some more suggestions.
She was 17 when she did this?
She was 16. She was
16, okay.
16 when she... So the film was filmed in 69, actually, and it was released in 71. So there was a 2-year-long post-production period on it.
Because her age became, at various stages of the film's classification and kind of release and stuff, her age became an issue, didn't it, because of the nudity, which, so I think particularly most famously in the swimming scene in the sort of waterhole, but it was, she was definitely not an adult, so it's kind of that. I mean, there are other things about this film we talked into it, the animal cruelty, which meant that it's had sort of variable classification over the years, but that's kind of the Jenny Agutter's age thing is a more prominent one, I think.
I mean, I think that in terms of the nudity in the film, I definitely felt aware that this was a 16-year-old girl in it, but often I felt more queasy about moments where the way that the camera looked at her, often when she was clothed in like the short school uniform skirt, there's a shot of her leaning into the car to get the picnic baskets out, that I'm like, that is a choice on a camera angle on a 16-year-old girl in a short skirt. And
It's a lot of fan service.
yeah.
Well, I agree with you that the whole uniform thing, and obviously is deeply fetishistic, and that's a thing in culture. I was going to ask you, I think that just as sort of a sidebar, but just because that neatly leads into what I was going to ask you, really, because the dad's attempted murder, suicide at the beginning is not explained. What's your read on that? I mean, Kat first, because I just remember, because I had certain teenage ideas about what's going on there, but obviously they're not corroborated. It's not like there's any wrong answer here, you know.
Yeah, and I remember, it's a very popular topic, like suicide in stories. And when I was first trying to write stories as a teenager, I was like, I'm going to have somebody in a story kill themselves because that's so cool and interesting. And then when I presented it to my teacher, she came back to me and she was like, I don't understand why they did it. Like, you need to motivate this. And I was like, they were really sad. Like, no, you need to motivate this. Like, you need to have really solid reasons to explain why this is going on. And I don't know that they did, but you were getting kind of the impression that this guy wasn't happy. And I didn't really feel like I needed it to be all that motivated. It's kind of like, well, I don't know what's going on for him. It could be any number of things, and you can kind of make it up for yourself. But I got really uncomfortable during that car scene with her taking the picnic stuff out of the car because of how sexualized she became in some of those shots, and the way her dad was looking at her. Like, I thought he was going to try and rape her.
Well,
like, that's what it felt like it was leading up to. And then I was like, well, maybe he wanted to, and then he realized that things were just totally fucked, and so he was going to try and kill her.
Well, that's kind of, I'll let you react to that as well, Nina, in a sec, but that's kind of what I'm getting at, in the sense that, like, I think the lasciviousness of the camera in that is probably most directly to be interpreted as the father's gaze, and I think it's more the way Agatha plays it, as like, she seems to know that he's a threat in that whole scene before that. I don't think she thinks he's going to shoot at them threat, but I think the tenseness between them two that the little boy seems oblivious to is something, isn't it? Because there's that one scene where she comes back to the car and they just exchange this glance, and it's like 2 seconds, but it's kind of, she gets out of there as quickly as she can again, and it's kind of, I think it's gloriously ambiguous, but I think something's happened in his behaviour that she's seen and been witness to over the past weeks or months or years or whatever, that the little boy hasn't. And I think that's one way to read it, that at least a tension around inappropriate feelings towards her is part of it. There might have been other stuff going on, but that's something I picked up on, I think, when I watched it. Nina, did you get that kind of?
Well, I'm also just sort of thinking about the way, in terms of how she's filmed, often aligns her with prey, especially with hunting being such a big theme within the film. She is often kind of depicted as and filmed as prey. And in fact, in terms of the swimming scene, one of the things that really got to me is the way that it's cutting between her swimming naked in this beautiful pool, which in many ways is actually not particularly sexualized, but then cutting to the boy hunting, the initial thing that he's hunting is he's fishing in water, and we have her like turning around, and then we have him in a different body of water with a spear, and this sort of objectification of her in that it's aligning her with the prey was, I think, a definite choice that was being made. I'm like, well, what are you actually trying to say about who this girl is? And
yeah,
it's almost like they just want to make her feel really vulnerable, and you to kind of be afraid for her. or just creating a little bit of tension there. Because I don't think that the film's trying to say that the boy wants to do any violence to her or that she's actually prey, but it's just setting up that little discomfort.
Yeah.
Well, and that chimes later with the boy being presented when he's doing his kind of what you can, I think you meant to interpret as a sort of courtship dance. You know, he is presented to, you know, mostly through her eyes in a sense as a weird alien threat, right? And as an invasive one, specifically when she's disrobing, you know, and like she like rushes to get dressed and then is scared of him as he's doing that, you know, whatever his intention of it is, you know. It's like, you know, we were talking about it, so there are bits that feel a bit like a horror movie. That's kind of slashery, you know, in some ways, isn't it? The idea of putting a partially clothed woman in peril for most of the movie, essentially. That's, you know, that's it. And I suppose actually, if you, and again, this is completely subjective, but if you do interpret the fact that the father had an unhealthy interest in her, not just, you know, homicidal desire, but, you know, desire, it makes it even more of a tragedy, doesn't it? That in a sense that trauma makes her I'm not going to say less receptive, because obviously she doesn't have a moral duty to be receptive, but, you know, kind of less able to deal with the boys' come-ons, I guess you'd say, like towards the end of the movie, you know.
Yeah, and I wonder if that's supposed to also say that she could never really fit in there, that maybe she has gone, you know, that she's so educated in her ways and so set in her ways that as soon as there's something that's kind of otherness to her, that she immediately sort of recoils from it. You know, I think they do a great job of not making this like a Disney movie where they just happen to understand each other, or she'd speak English to him and he would for some reason understand it. You know,
gender swap Pocahontas, it could have been.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
And I think that it's nice that they didn't go there. You know, and one thing I noticed about her character is just how quickly she goes into action mode as soon as her dad is firing. Like the lack of time to process it or to be shocked. She's just immediately like, we're going, like, I'm taking over, I'm leading this, which I think, David, would go more towards your point about maybe a history of sexual violence with the father.
She's expecting something. Yeah, that's the impression.
Yeah, she's expecting something, and there's not this like, Dad, what are you doing? You know, there's no appeal to him to stop. It's just this like sudden understanding like that we're in danger and we need to go.
Yeah. No, I agree. His dialogue over that, but while he's shooting at them behind the rock and he's talking to them, entreating him, but I think he says he's basically addressing her, and he says something like, "Come out and bring him." He doesn't even name the boy. He's just like, you know, just bring. Almost like the boy isn't really anything to him. The little boy.
Yeah,
you know,
and bring him too. Yeah.
Yeah, which also suggests a fixation, I suppose, but as well as just keeping the anonymous kind of gimmick of the movie, I suppose. I suppose the girl's character of just being utterly subsumed by the need, the socially imposed need for control, is something from the early frames, isn't it? Because, you know, you see her. I love, by the way, that the first sort of 5 minutes of the movie that show the city that they're in. I don't know if it's meant to be like in Melbourne or Adelaide or whatever, you know, but the sort of, I guess, South Australian city is just amazing, and it's so weird and haunting, and it's kind of. It's before they've even really introduced you to the outback environment. You think, how much weirder could it get? Because this is a strange place, and the way they film it and the soundtrack, the sort of, you know, I guess there's quite a lot of kind of, you know, Aboriginal. There's some didgeridoo music and stuff over that, isn't there? That's really atonal and odd to sort of Western ear, and it's really haunting. And obviously you see bits and pieces of Dad, and I love the bit where you see the woman who I presume is their mum, like. And they're just listening to it. One of my favorite. We'll talk more about the sound in the second half of the podcast. But one of my favorite things in this is the repeated radio broadcasts that they listen to, which are just like they're kind of like genuinely a bit post-apocalyptic, aren't they? They're like kind of, because they're these bizarre kind of etiquette lessons that are being broadcast all the time. And is it the one our mum's listening to is the thing? It's like, is it like how to cook some sort of bird by drowning it in cognac? And it's like,
is it something to do with foie gras and overfeeding the birds to get the liver?
Yeah. As a squeamish veggie, I didn't even dare to look it up. But I was like,
Yeah,
but
same.
they have that dialogue about the bird trying to like questing towards the light, you know, and things like that. And it's like, and then it's just like, you know, it's actually considered quite a delicacy. And you just like, I suppose you get that. It ties in well with the very end of the movie, doesn't it? Where you see that the girl has arrived at a similar kind of suburban nothing existence, you know, where she's just she might as well be listening to these kind of self-help tapes, essentially, or whatever that broadcast is.
And it's also sort of showing the sort of savagery of civilized living, the sort of points that it's making in terms of, yes, the boy goes out and hunts his own food, and in some ways that may seem more violent, but that juxtaposed with the literally juxtaposed with the butcher shop and things like that, and the showing of the sort of clinical removedness of the colonial culture that just is separating human beings from what they're eating and from death, but that it's no less brutal when it's separated like that. And in some ways there is more feeling and respect in a culture where you kill your own meat out of necessity and you know what the animal is giving up in order for you to live.
No, I agree with that, but again, kind of, I suppose, chiming with what I said before, I think it mostly resists, there are some exceptions, I think it mostly resists the temptation to do that kind of end of the 60s, this is the Edenic way and civilization is terrible, and this is, you know, this is the way to live, by also making the outback and the way of surviving the outback look brutal and horrible and raw and dangerous and you know, like alienating and not easy for anyone. You know, whereas you might say like the Aboriginal people, quote unquote, belong there. You know, they've adapted to it. They live in balance with it, but it doesn't look like they're having a great time. And you know, you know, to put it bluntly, you know, it's kind of I like to not misunderstand me. I like that about it. You know,
I was essentially gonna say the same thing as Nanina, so I wanted to piggyback on that a little bit. You know, because this is very much that anthropological idea of, you know, looking at yourself as the other as well and seeing the sort of otherness within your own society, and this idea that everything that everybody does is a little bit weird. and I think that also kind of goes towards what you were saying, David, about I think this just means everything's hell, because it's not trying to say that the Aboriginal way of life is better, and it's not trying to say that the, you know, civilized society life is better either. It's kind of showing what is really strange between the two or about the two. And I thought that intercutting with the butcher knife scene, like, it felt like Baraka to me. It felt like some of those like abstractions where they do these like really hard cuts between these very obvious sort of metaphorically balanced things. And the other thing was that intercutting between the hunters shooting the animals and intercutting with the you know, throwing the spear and beating something over the head with it, where you start to almost go like, oh, that's kind of horrible, the way they're just like the efficiency of that brutality of just like bam bam bam. They're like, do they need that much? You know, and you're starting to think like, you almost empathize a bit more with what you thought was so violent, you know, when you saw it 20 minutes ago.
Yeah, no, I think that's true, and I think you know, all these ways of living are necessarily brutalistic and contain elements of brutality. But I think one of the purposes of the little boy as a character in general in the film is to show that some of these, again, we get on our rails, but it's not too late to adapt to other ways of living. You know, like or at least it isn't when you're, you know, 7 or however old he's meant to be. You know, like it's kind of, but it gets too late quite quickly. You know, because they nearly, you know, they very nearly die. Let's put it that way. You know, I mean, they are dying of thirst, you know, and heat exhaustion and everything when the boy finds them. And you know, it's kind of another thing it reminded me of. I mentioned the post-apocalyptic side of it. There's that Raymond Briggs animation that I think I've mentioned on the podcast before in other episodes, When the Wind Blows, which in that case is about a couple trying to survive a nuclear Holocaust, essentially. It's about, but the thing it has in common with Walkabout, the first 35 minutes especially, is that the couple is reliant on like radio broadcasts and government information, and how to comport yourself Britishly in this situation. And in When the Wind Blows, minor spoilers, it doesn't go well for them, and it's to do with basic things like clean water and like just things that you would need in that situation that they have been very ill prepared for by the pigeonholing of their environment, I suppose, and their upbringing in their society. And that this time watching it, Walkabout reminded me of that, because there'd be a different version of Walkabout as a short movie that I'd be quite happy with if it literally ended with the implication that the girl and the little boy were dying, were about to die essentially, and were just lost in this desert delirium. Because there's enough in if you take that first 35 minutes, there's enough there like to analyze and to go into, and even if it was that downbeat, really bleak ending, I'd be that in itself is a self-contained drama, I think.
Well, I find it interesting because while I was watching, I was thinking about how much Walkabout, I think, influenced sci-fi movies that came after. And there's definitely this feeling of an otherworldliness feeling, and of these two kids lost in this completely alien landscape to them. And the way the Outback is filmed is kind of the way many sci-fi films approach other planets. I actually, when I was watching it a second time with Joe, and the little boy was saying how he wanted to go off across the sand and he didn't want to be going up any more mountains, I turned to Joe and I was like, I'm not going that way, it's much too rocky, from C-3PO talking to R2-D2. This way is much easier.
Oh my god, Walkabout with C-3PO and R2-D2 would be an incredible thing. And they meet some other Star Wars character. Yeah, I love it. Yeah, if they hallucinate, if the girl and the little boy start hallucinating, and they see a Jawa sandcrawler on the horizon. That would be,
exactly.
So we should do an edit of that. Yeah. Well, actually, the other thing, Kat, we were talking about Capricorn 1 recently, being another one of my favourite movies, and that has the three astronauts in that who are trying to get across the desert and are going delirious with thirst, and you
just love people lost in deserts, don't you?
It's as a city boy, I just love the idea of leaving the city. It's just this vicarious thing I'll never do. Well, would either of you two like to get in final thoughts on that kind of topic, or shall we take a quick break?
Oh, I mean, I just want to applaud Nanina on that point, that it really does look like a planetary landscape, and I think that's partly to do with the vastness of it. So it would almost be hard for films like sci-fi films not to kind of use similar tropes, especially with like the horror sense of it.
And also the way that it films things like the sky in addition to the landscape, and the sort of burning eye of the sun and all of that as well. And at the end, when she steps onto the road, there's a close-up of her shoes as she steps onto the road. I'm like, that is kind of quoting Wizard of Oz. In my mind, I was just like, and that is Dorothy stepping onto the yellow brick road, which I think is a kind of deliberate allusion, whether or not it's subconscious. But she's heading home.
That's interesting. We'll talk a bit more about the soundtrack in the second half, but the scene where the dad is in the car and she's getting the picnic out, there's a song playing on the radio, which is I certainly heard through watching Walkabout, and it's a Rod Stewart song, which then was quite a new song called Gasoline Alley. Obviously, the Gasoline Alley is ironic given that the dad's about to burn himself to death. But I was looking at the lyrics to that song because it sounds. I think it's largely picked because the instrumentation. I don't know why Nick Rogue picked it, but the instrumentation sounds very kind of cod Australian folk, I guess, But the lyrics of that are all about wanting to return home. They're all about being from a certain neighbourhood and thinking that maybe it's best to go back where you belong, so to speak. I was looking them up before we started this because I don't know Rod Stewart that well, but I've always loved the sound of that song, and I'm looking forward to seeing how much of the music from Walkabout I can get into this podcast without getting sued, because YouTube are quite on it these days, so I'm going to be quite diligent. But I'll tell you what, let's take a brief break, and I'll come back with an anecdote, and then we'll talk about some other stuff that you guys want to talk about.
Sounds good.
I made Walkabout when I was 16, but in fact I first heard about the film when I was 14 years old. And I was at a ballet school, and I had got into acting by chance by being in a film about ballet. But I'd done various different pieces for television and film. And Nicholas Roeg's wife, Sue Stevens at that time, had seen me do a television, age 14, which was a love story. And it was a very good role, and she recommended, she knew Nick was making Walkabout, and she said she thought that he ought to meet me. So apparently that's how I was sort of chosen to meet. So my first memories were going up from school and meeting Nicholas Roeg in his flat. And I remember meeting this very, very enthusiastic man who talked about making a film. I knew nothing about him. I really knew nothing about his history as a cameraman. I knew that he had made some wonderful films as a DOP. And he talked about Walkabout, and he said he was going to make this film, whether he had to get out a handheld camera, whatever he was going to do, he was going to make this film, because he was so excited about it. And he said, without any doubt about it, he said, and you will play the girl. And then he pointed to a young boy who was in the corner of the room, and he said, and he will play your brother. And this young boy was standing on his head at the time and was Nicholas Roeg's son. But then some time went by, and I didn't hear very much more about it. I think I do remember when I'd first heard about it, the only thing that really impressed me was that it was going to be produced by Apple, who of course were the Beatles, and I thought, this is very exciting, I'll get to meet the Beatles. But anyway, time went by, and nothing really, from my point of view, seemed to be happening. But during that time, I think Nicholas Roeg was making Performance with Donald Cammell. And then when I was 16, the film came up again, and I read the script, and it was it was quite a fine script, but a very, very carefully written script by Edward Bond. And I was also given the book to read that it came from, James Vance Marshall's book. And I went to meet Nick Roeg again, it's interesting because I think I would have been far too young if I'd done it 14, 15. And just that difference in age made it exactly right, because that girl is just on the cusp of growing up. And at 14, 15, I was very young. At 16, one's just on that edge, which is what he very much used in the film, Nicholas Roeg. So that was how I was cast.
Welcome back. And Nanina, Kat, I just wanted to, before we go further in chatting a bit more about other aspects of Walkabout, I just wanted to tell you quickly about the time that I met Jenny Agutter. Because that was weird. It was completely by accident. Not that I've met that many celebrities in my life, but obviously, often if you meet celebrities, there's a kind of deliberate aspect to it. If you go to a con or something like that, where they're going to be speaking or signing stuff or everything, and this wasn't that at all. So I still live in South London, but I lived in a slightly different part of South London about 6 years ago, and I went along to it was a really sort of geeky, wonkish kind of transport rally thing that in that part of London, and basically it was to do with getting the tube extended, and there's local politicians were talking there, our local MP was talking there, and a bunch of speakers were kind of lobbying essentially for this thing to happen, and I was in the audience there, and I was actually hoping to sort of schmooze with some of the local politicians there, who were kind of involved in the Labour Party there, that kind of thing. And a lady got up to speak in favour of this tube extension. She was a kind of oldish, middle-aged, very well-spoken lady, and she started speaking about it and just really, really rousingly kind of talking about it, and I was like, she's really familiar. She's kind of, is that, no. I was like, is that Jenny Agutter, the actress? And she was like, and she finished speaking. I was like, by the end of it, I was kind of, yeah, because she's still a very active actress, particularly on British television and stuff like that, so she's been in the popular show called The Midwife for the past sort of 10 years, and right. I can't remember if that's wrapped now, but she's very well known to contemporary TV audiences in that role now as an older actress. She's almost exactly the same age as my mum, which is another weird thing about the story. But
and she was wearing the school uniform, so it was pretty easy.
She was still wearing that, yeah, which is kind of a weird quirk, but it was good, look good, and but basically, so afterwards, she was hanging around, and she was chatting to loads of people she knew there, and I did my thing where I was chatting to some of the local Labour politicians and things like that, and screwing up my own form of courage for that, because even that's that kind of a thing that you're nervous about sometimes. But then I was like, am I going to do it? And I was like, I can't not really. And I was like, Miss Agutter, your films mean quite a lot to me, or something that's really awkward like that. You know, this is me as like a 28-year-old man as well. You know, this wasn't kind of. I think she almost instantly mistook me for an art student, by the way, because there's quite a lot of art students in that part of South London, and I think she probably thought I was that, you know, which I wasn't. But I realised that I was. So suddenly I was talking to this woman about the same age as my mum about her movies, and I think I was like, yeah, you know, two in particular of your movies just mean so much to me and my family, you know. And she was like, oh, which ones? And I was like, Walkabout and American Werewolf in London, and then in that breath I was like, those are two of the famous ones where she has nude scenes. And I was like, it's kind of like in my head I was like, you know, like I sound really weird, and like she was actually the loveliest person. She was really, really nice, and she kind of she probably gets hassled all the time, and like, you know, she was very nice in terms of telling me a couple of anecdotes about, you know, Nick Rogue and John Landis and all that kind of stuff, which I should say I can't remember any of those now because I was absolutely starstruck.
Please share.
No, I mean, I think it was just along the lines of, you know, they were lovely to work with, and she's very proud of the work, and you know, that kind of thing. But she just turns out to be this kind of person who's just involved with the community around there, and you know, just kind of you know, fully settled in and everything. But I did feel very very kind of awestruck, because I guess that she does have that kind of cut glass English voice as well, you know, and it's just kind of. It's not the kind of English accent that I'm used to hearing outside films, really. You know, even now that I live in the south of England, and it was kind of amazing, and you know, kind of I do really like her as an actress as well. You know, she's in she's in a bunch of stuff if you go back in British culture, like The Railway Children, and I really like her in Logan's Run as well. You know, talk about sci-fi before. You know, like she's the kind of the lead actress in that, opposite Michael York and things like that. You know, I just really, I think in Walkabout she's really much better than she has any right to be, given, as you were saying, Nanina, like not just her age, but like maybe the lack of kind of emoting direction she was given. You know, maybe it's just one of those things where the end product just ends up working for you. But
I think she probably appreciated Walkabout being mentioned, because in the interviews and the commentary that I watched with her, she was talking about how Walkabout was coming at a point in her career that she wasn't sure if she was going to continue on with the acting, or if she wanted to take her A-levels and go to university, and she actually chose Walkabout, but that it was a really formational movie for her, and talked really lovingly about it as being a great experience, which I was relieved to hear, because I was a little concerned about if it was such a great experience for her.
Yeah,
I was worried about her.
Yeah,
you're just always concerned these days, aren't you? When you see, especially when you think about, you know, young women involved in film projects and stuff. It's just like, you know, oh, please let that have been good. Just, you know, on any level, like.
Yeah.
Though an interesting moment in the audio commentary that I watched, which, as David mentioned before, was both Nicholas Roeg and Jenny Agutter. But they had been recorded separately, so they were being edited back and forth. And when it came to the scene of her swimming, the nude scene, Nicholas Roeg was like, yeah, she had no problem with it. It was not difficult at all for her. I mean, we'd all been living together, camping for months by then, and, you know, everyone knew everything. And then it immediately cut to her being like, yeah, it wasn't easy. I was really uncomfortable. But, you know, they did everything to make it feel more comfortable, and Nicholas Roeg showed me these paintings by an Australian artist to show the sort of imagery that he was going for, and it was on a really long lens, and I was all by myself, and so it was very hard, but it's a beautiful scene. And actually, I think, again, that scene I think is really beautifully done, and actually less sexualized than many of the others. But what really pisses me off, actually, is the way that they use that scene on the poster. And I think that taking that scene out of context, actually, I think is kind of disrespectful, and using, like, marketing, you are going to see her naked type, which is the way marketing often works, but the way that the film kind of wants to have it both ways, of being like, no, this is just pure and innocent, and why are you having dirty thoughts about it? and saying that it's anything less than being pure and innocent, but also knowing that the way that the film was marketed relied pretty heavily on it.
Well, it's remembered in British pop culture as that moment. Like, I mean, people ladishly. I think I read in film magazines growing up that, especially British men of a certain generation, that's like the bit where Jenny Agutter swims naked. Like that's kind of like the sort of coming of age moment for a lot of British men. And it's kind of, and I was aware of that watching it as well. I think even maybe in the intro they mentioned it or something when it was on TV when I recorded it. But what it's reminding me of this time around was is it Millet, like the Ophelia in the water? Like, because I think the amount of suicide in this movie, apart from anything else, I was just kind of like, that it was putting me in mind of that. But the sort of shimmery elegance of it and the way her body is kind of almost abstracted in some ways, isn't it, by the water?
Yeah, it definitely is.
I really like that, and I kind of the music as well. I mean, I've talked a bit about the use of some sort of diegetic music in this and stuff, but the score is I read was by John Barry, which I don't think I'd ever clocked before. But basically, I suppose like most famous as the James Bond composer, really. But that lovely music that they have playing over her then, and it recurs at certain other points in the movie as well. That kind of sweeping kind of the strings sort of suite that they play, it's gorgeous. I want to briefly say to you, because you were talking about Jenny Agutter kind of recommitting in a sense to acting after Walkabout, and I was thinking sort of facetiously that might be because she got to go to Australia, which is quite a cool thing to do. I was going to ask you, have either of you seen Picnic at Hanging Rock?
No.
I've been meaning to for a very long time, but I have not.
It's interesting because that's another one of my, I wouldn't say very favourite movies, but I really, really like that movie, and it's directed by Peter Weir. It's from the mid-70s, and it's kind of, it's more commonly credited as being like the birth of modern Australian cinema, really, which is something that Walkabout tends to be one of those things that gets mentioned as being a sort of precursor of. But the reason I mention it is Picnic at Hanging Rock. I won't spoil it, but Picnic at Hanging Rock not only is to do with schoolgirls and is kind of has some of the sort of fetishy kind of eroticization elements that Walkabout sort of plays with a little bit, but also it's really, really, I'd say more so to do with the kind of strangeness and exoticness of the Australian outback, and about the kind of the creepiness and more overt supernaturalness of the Australian outback. And Hanging Rock is almost like you can imagine the kids in that passing by the kids in Walkabout, like maybe in the next valley over, and in Hanging Rock it's much more about I suppose, like you might say, the more slightly mystical ways in which people could go into that environment and not come back, or not come back the same, which Walkabout has. I think it has an element of that, but it's kind of more to do with like realistic or semi-realistic things happening, whereas Hanging Rock is maybe the more kind of spooky version of that. But I thought that's an interesting one to look out if afterwards, because I think there's some stylistic things as well. I'd say Hanging Rock kind of uses maybe more Kubrickian stuff actually to kind of make the outback scary, genuinely scary and eerie, as opposed to just overwhelming and alien.
I find it interesting the way you're sort of talking about Walkabout as being realistic, and Kat, you brought up sort of how it is a bit slice of lifey. Well, to me, a lot of it felt really allegorical, and it didn't feel particularly realistic at any point. There is the sort of brutality of the desert, but I remember actually in the first part of the movie, before they meet the little boy running around in the desert like it's a sandbox, and they climb several hills during that time, and they don't seem to be tired. And then suddenly she's having to carry him through the desert. But there is this sort of otherworldly, allegorical feeling to it, which comes in incredibly to the fore with the oasis and the fruits and the snakes in the trees. And there's a lot about sort of pre-lapsarian imagery in the Garden of Eden, and the girl and the boy sort of creating their own Eden, and also the tree overnight shriveling up is imagery in several biblical stories, including Jonah. He takes refuge under a fig tree, which the next day has shriveled up. I think that I always felt like there was a removal, a sort of fairy tale aspect to it, a storytelling aspect to it that felt artificial to me, not necessarily in a bad way, just in a stylistic choice way. So I kind of find it interesting that to you guys it felt more sort of realistic, or I don't know.
Well, I definitely just briefly.
I did use the word documentary, so.
Yeah, well, that's one of the strange things about the aesthetic, isn't it? Because you've got those, obviously, like you've mentioned National Geographic earlier in the podcast, Kat. Like it's got that sort of proto National Geographic kind of, super zoom in on a random iguana kind of thing.
Yeah.
But you've got I looked up the Stockhausen composed hymnen, it's called, which gives it this choral kind of churchy, very very intense kind of religious trek kind of feel, and the idea of wandering in the desert, of course, which is the Exodus there, I think it's just there's a whole bunch of stuff mixed up in it, which I think is partly what I found so interesting as a teenager. There was a whole bunch of stuff combined in there, some of elements of which I found familiar, but led to the whole thing feeling very disconcerting overall. Like I was actually going to bring up to you quickly, like, we were talking before about how the film makes Western civilization look monstrous and unpleasant and scary and overwhelming. There's also that weird bit, is it about 2/3 of the way through the movie, where, because you have those little bits where they run across, or at least one of them runs across, the boy runs across, white civilization in the outback, but there's the bit where they meet those scientists, I think it's around about the bit with the weather balloon. And there's that really strange bit where it like stylistically it sort of becomes like a kind of slightly bawdy sex comedy for about 2 minutes, where there's one scientist who's like an attractive woman and the guys are kind of creeping on her, and there's more kind of male gaze stuff.
Yeah.
But do you remember there's some music that kind of makes it feel really kind of knockabout and kind of like casual and kind of a bit like, oh, what's going to happen now? And as it is, there's another film happening, so you just leave that scene behind, and it kind of, you get back to our protagonist, but it's kind of, that's another bit where it's kind of like, it almost takes this sidestep into being this other film, but again, it sort of seems to be pointing out how ridiculous and seedy and childish, and how like essentially the grown-ups, you meet some more grown-ups and they're not very grown-up, and they shouldn't be in charge of anything, and they barely are, that they're flirting so much and taking their eye off the ball that they almost like muck up their science experiment, like the weather balloon like runs away with them and stuff, and it's just kind of, I thought that was another weird moment where when I first watched it I was like, what's going on, like
have either of you seen Tampopo, the ramen western, but that film has a sort of main story about this ramen shop, but then there are these side vignettes that happen that are often quite broad, and to me that section of Walkabout kind of reminded me in its own little surreal way of some of the bits in Tampopo, though all of those have to do with food and death and life and sex, and it's kind of a fascinating Japanese film.
Yeah, I've heard of it. Yeah, I've never got around to watching it. I was thinking, there's little side vignettes and Walkabout. I was thinking again, watching it today, that the bit I'd forgotten about was the bit where I think it's a little bit further on in the movie when it's when the boy goes to speak briefly to that woman, and she sees them walking off with the girl and the little boy, but she doesn't say anything, and she then goes back to her village, I guess, in the outback, and there's a really strange kind of 3-minute segment where the bit where you've got that kind of like cottage industry, is it like making pots and things like that, and you've got a bunch of Aboriginals like working. It's not exactly clear how coercive it is, but you've got a lot of people like working in a sort of like factory making these like, I guess, like tourist souvenirs, and you've got the guy who seems like really repulsive, who's kind of like the boss of the place, and I guess her husband, and it's kind of and I never noticed this before, but the N-word gets used as well to describe the workers, and it's just kind of it's something I'd never clocked before, because it's kind of said without much emphasis on the dialogue, but it's kind of, I suppose it's similarly to the bit where the car is being stripped. You've got the idea of the Aboriginal people in this area kind of surviving on what are now the fringes of mainstream Australian white society, and scraping a living in these ways that kind of meld their society with the pickings to be had from white society. It's really, it's quite disturbing. Yeah,
I was actually going to mention that scene, because that's the only one where I kind of felt like the movie was doing a disservice to the Aboriginal people, because I mean, for the most part, I think it handles things fairly well and actually kind of villainizes white people a lot more than it does people of color. But it just reminded me of like 2001 with the monkeys throwing the sticks at the start of that, or any kind of like Planet of the Apes kind of things. It had that kind of cacophony thing, and I was like, this is uncomfortable.
You
and
think
then
it's kind of
they had
othering the way they use it, you know?
Yeah, and the sort of horror of the father who's hanging in the bush and rotting, and how they seem to think that's fine, you know, and yeah, so that part was a little uncomfortable for me, and I thought that scene was kind of problematic. And then it was weird to just then have them walking off as a group while the car was still there. And they didn't really show what they'd taken from it, so it didn't even feel like, oh, this intelligent group of people has come to scavenge from this and they've taken their wares and they're going now. Instead, it was just them kind of crawling all over this thing, and it was very animalistic.
And everyone there in Madam Good and said, yeah, him. That's him there, yeah. And I said, why me? What about you? You don't go like that. And I said, yes. And then Nicholas Rowe arrived in Madam Grida. That was 1969.
And you were what, 16 at the time?
Yeah, I was 14, I think. 12, 14. And he came, they asked me, see if I can play that film Walkabout. That was my first time. I thought I was going to be John Wayne film, you know. But anyway, I went to Alice Spring, and I met the director and Jenny Agata, and she was in school. And I was a bush boy, and a little son, Nicholas Rowe's son, to play.
Yeah.
And that was the first time for me, experience.
Now, you didn't speak English at this time.
I never speak English. And Richard, my brother-in-law, he was helping me to talk. He said, yes, you say, yes. And he said, we go this way. He was translating all the English for me. And when I went to London to premiere, I had a red carpet from Countess all the way down to Her Majesty Queen of England for Queen Car. I jumped in there, Spear and Umrah, and I walk up there, and I come out with a crowd on Buckingham Palace. And I walk with my lap on. That's it, no shirt.
I hope it was summer.
So in there, if I'm standing, I was standing there, and it was really cold, just like here. Really cold. And I was naked. Almost as naked, had nothing in there, nothing at all. And I was standing. The Queen was. Can I take this phone? Can I take it? Thank you. The Queen was saying, walking and said, yeah, and there's a kid that's standing on like that.
Hold it closer.
Is he got a tail? And asking this little one, asking the Queen, and I said, is that Aborigines got a tail? Said, no, that's a kangaroo, you know. That's a kangaroo, you know, that's different. And I keep going like that, and I was looking at him. By the time I understand, it said, I called me, all right, well, it was really cold in London. Anyone would have went there and naked would stand like that. Go like that. I didn't. It was naked standing like that and walking proud.
Yeah.
You know,
well,
London.
you've always done that in film.
Thank you.
Making that film, did you understand the film process?
Well, I understood that when we was seeing that the first time, I don't know what the camera is about. And the second time, there's a rush that we can see. From first shooting, and next day we see the rushes.
Did you see yourself on film?
Yeah, and outside
the
the double-head projector.
Right.
See, that the sound and film here going in the bush.
Nanina, were you saying before that you kind of interpreted the placement of the dad's body in the tree as being almost like a gesture of like cultural respect, or not cultural respect, but kind of cultural appropriateness for the Aborigines?
Not on first viewing. And so I don't know how effective it is. And Kat, I had kind of a similar reaction to the scene of the Aborigines in the car, but with the context of the later death of the boy and him being hung in the tree, and realizing on second viewing, seeing the father in the tree, initially I was like, how did he get there? And on second viewing I'm like, oh, the Aborigines found his body and put it in the tree. But I don't think it works, because you don't have enough context in order to interpret it that way unless you're watching it multiple times and watching the audio commentary and things like that. And actually Nicholas Roeg said that they don't take anything from the car. So that it...
Did he say in the commentary about the Aboriginal people putting people into trees when they're dead?
So that I did hear a fair bit about in interviews, and so it's about not wanting your spirit to be absorbed into the ground. That you should, when you die, you should be off the ground. And actually, in the book, the boy dies because he catches a flu from the little boy, and he asks them to put him up in the tree so that his spirit...
Well, that makes so much more sense.
Yeah, and actually, I think in terms of the depiction of the boy, who I do think is really well acted by David Gilpa, and I think that there could be a really fascinating version of the film if you understood his language and didn't understand English, because I really wanted to know what he was saying and to have the English people more othered than him. But the fact that he dies really bothers me, actually. And it's not from some sentimental reason. I think that it makes him more of a symbol than a human being. And I think that I would have much rather he had just walked off and left them.
Yeah.
I'm really glad you brought up the book and the differences in that sense, because I was thinking that when I read that today, but also in terms of looking at the book's summary, I was thinking it sounds in the book like you do get a lot more of insights into the boy and his way of thinking and what their presence means to him. And the impression I got from the summary was that in the book, because of his inner monologue or insights, you get much more of the emphasis that this walkabout that he's on is something he's undertaking that's a rite of passage and that's very, very important in a sort of social, religious way. And they've come along, he's not a bad person, he wants to help them, but they've come along at pretty much the worst time they could have done for him. So it's like the idea of, imagine you were on the way to the most important job interview of your life and suddenly two people needed a lot of help. It's like, well, I'm a good person, so I will help you, but this is tremendously troubling, and I'm aware of all the stuff I'm missing out on here, because he's meant to be alone. In a spiritual way, he's meant to be alone. It's wrong for him that other people are there, which I don't think the film really gets across. Even
not at all.
In its performance and the direction, not to blame the actor. But the thing, the phrase that, so to be slightly provocative here, so my interpretation of what happens is that the boy, grows to love them as a family unit and is attracted to the girl and wants to be with the girl on whatever length of basis, I don't know, but he does his courtship dance, he is rebuffed, ignored essentially, but rebuffed, and then he kills himself. That's what I think happens. But